The lane never went quiet. That was the first thing that told me something was wrong. I've worked the San Marcos checkpoint on I-19 for 19 years, 42 miles north of the Mexico border. And in all that time, I never once heard the northbound lanes go silent while they were full. Engines idle. That's the sound of the job. The sound I stopped hearing sometime around my 3rd year, the way you stop hearing your own furnace at home. 200 vehicles a day sometimes. Bumper to bumper in the afternoon heat. Diesels ticking over. Gas engines running rough where somebody's timing belt was going. Car radios bleeding norteño and talk shows through cracked windows. A baby crying 4 cars back. Somebody's air conditioning compressor kicking on and off. The whole line breathing like one big animal that just wants to keep moving north. You learn the sound the way a rancher learns the sound of his own herd. It becomes the floor under everything else. And you only notice it when it changes. At 2:14 that afternoon, the floor dropped out from under all of us at once. Every engine in the queue died at the same moment, not one after another, the way a traffic jam clears when the light up ahead turns green and the release ripples backward car by car. All of them, 60, 70 vehicles from the primary booths back past the curve where the shoulder drops into the wash, and I couldn't even see the tail of the line. And they all just stopped, together, in the same half-second. Like somebody standing above the whole valley had reached down and turned a single key. The dashboards went dark. The radios cut mid-word. A woman's laugh in the second lane got sheared off clean. My own booth lights flickered once, browned down to a dull orange, and then held. And the sound that was left in the space where all those engines had been was wind moving through the creosote and the dry mesquite along the fence. And a semi-driver 20 feet from me. A big man in a Diamondbacks cap, with his door already open and one boot on the running board, saying real quiet, almost to himself, "That's not right. That's not right at all." I'm going to step out of it for 1 second, because I owe you that much before I take you the rest of the way in. Thank you to everyone who keeps coming back to sit with these stories. And if this is your first time here, I'm genuinely glad you found the channel. If this kind of thing is what you're after, stay with us. Leave a comment. Tell me what you'd have done in my boots. It honestly helps more than you know. Now, let me get back to that afternoon. Because within 4 minutes of the engines dying, the first person in that line started screaming. And it wasn't from a car crash. And it wasn't a sound any of us had a place to file. My name is Ruben Aldaco. I was 51 that year, a supervisory officer, 26 years in federal service if you count the 6 I did up in the Dakotas before I transferred down to the southern corridor to be closer to my mother while she was dying. I'm not a hero, and I want that clear up front, before you build me into something in your head that I'm not. I'm a man who spent most of his working life inside a metal booth checking license plates and asking people where they were born and whether they had any fruit or firearms in the vehicle. That's the job. It's mostly boredom and heat and paperwork. And the one real skill I ever developed was reading faces. You do this long enough, and you can tell in half a second whether a man is sweating because he's got a warrant out on him, or sweating because his wife is in labor in the passenger seat, and he's terrified you're going to make him wait. I could read a lie coming 3 cars back. I could read grief and fear, and the particular flat calm of a man carrying something in his trunk he shouldn't. I built a whole career on it. And I could not, on that afternoon, read a single thing about what was happening. And that scared me worse than anything that came after it. Because it meant the one tool I trusted was useless in the one place I needed it. Our station sits in a wide, flat bowl of desert. The kind of place that looks like nothing from the highway and turns out to be 100 small things once you've worked it a couple decades. The Santa Rita foothills stack up blue and hazy off to the east, close enough that you can watch the light move down them in the evening. To the west, there's nothing much but scrub and a dry wash that only runs 3 days a year. When the monsoon breaks hard enough up in the mountains to send a wall of brown water down through it. And the rest of the time, it's just a snake of pale sand and rounded stones cutting across the flat. The checkpoint itself is 8 primary lanes under a long steel canopy that ticks and pops all day as the sun works it. There's a secondary inspection yard fenced in chain link with a slide gate, an admin building with our offices and the break room and 2 holding cells and the little medical station, a generator shed, a fuel depot for the fleet vehicles behind a berm, and a comms tower with the FAA obstruction light on top that carried our radio repeater and the microwave dish that linked us back to the sector office in Tucson. 31 of us on shift that day. Officers, 2 K9 handlers, our maintenance man, Cliff Otero, and a contract nurse, Dana Whitmer, who ran the medical station where we treated dehydrated crossers and the occasional heart attack, and once, memorably, a man who'd been bitten by a rattlesnake and driven himself 40 minutes to us because he didn't trust anyone closer. 31 people and a parking lot's worth of civilians whose cars had just gone dead all at once. And no idea yet that the 2 facts were about to become the same problem. The man screaming was in a green Tahoe in lane 3. By the time I got the booth door open and came around the front of it, my knees stiff from sitting. 3 other people were already out of their vehicles and backing away from him with the particular careful steps people use around something they don't understand. And I understood why in the first second. And my understanding didn't help me at all. He was holding his own left hand up in front of his face and staring at it like it belonged to someone else. And the hand was wrong. The color was wrong. The fingers had gone a deep bruised gray in the space of the 4 minutes since the engines died. Gray the way a man's leg goes when the blood stops feeding it, that dead, mottled color. And the gray was climbing his wrist while I stood there watching, moving under the skin like frost spreading across a windshield. He wasn't screaming from pain, and I knew the difference. I've heard pain screaming. I've stood in the secondary yard with men who had crush injuries from riding in wheel wells. And I know exactly what agony sounds like. This was not that. This was worse. He was screaming because he could feel something moving up his arm toward the center of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. And some animal part of him knew that before his mind did. His name, I found out later from the license I'd handed back to him an hour before, was Terrence Voss, 44, of Nogales. He'd come through my lane at primary. I remembered him because he was easy to remember. Sunburned across the nose, friendly, a case of oranges sweating in the back of the Tahoe that I'd waved through because the citrus season was heavy that August, and nobody enforces oranges when the whole valley's drowning in them. He'd said, "Hot one, huh?" resting his forearm on the window frame, and I'd said, "Every one of them is." Which is what I always said, and that was the entire history of our acquaintance. And now he was down on his knees on the asphalt, with his arm the color of a thunderhead, and his wife trying to haul him back into the truck by his belt, and him screaming at her not to touch him. "Don't touch me, Renata. Don't you touch me. Get back. Get in the car." Cliff Otero got to me first. He'd been out by the generator shed, and he came across the lot at a fast walk, not a run, because Cliff didn't run. 60-something, lean and sun-cured. A Vietnam-era Navy tattoo gone green and formless on his forearm, and a way of talking like every word he spent was coming out of his own pocket. He stopped beside me and looked at Voss for maybe 2 seconds, and then he did the thing that told me Cliff was already 3 steps ahead of the rest of us, which was that he stopped looking at the screaming man entirely and turned his head to look at the whole property, sweeping it the way you check a room for the exit before you deal with the fire. Then he said the thing that turned out to be the single most important sentence anybody spoke that whole day. "Ruben, it ain't just his car, and it ain't just him. Look at the tower." I looked at the tower. Our comms mast had a red obstruction light at the top that ran 24 hours a day on a dedicated circuit. Its own battery, its own everything. Separate from the main power, and separate from the grid. Because the FAA required it in case a low aircraft came through the valley at night. In 19 years of working under that mast, I had never once seen that light dark. It was part of the furniture of the sky over that station. You stopped seeing it the way you stopped seeing the North Star. It was dark. Everything electrical in a bubble around our station had stopped at 2:14. And it had stopped so completely that even the one circuit that had no business failing, the circuit designed by federal regulation to survive exactly this kind of event, had failed with all the rest. And inside that same bubble, a man's arm was turning to stone in front of his wife. And those two facts were connected. I knew it in my gut the way you know weather is coming. And I did not have the first idea how. I got on my handheld out of pure reflex, thumbed the transmit key and got my mouth halfway to it before I remembered it couldn't work. Dead. Not even the little squelch you get when you key up. The repeater on the tower was dead, so even officer to officer, booth to booth, went nowhere. I looked back toward the admin building and saw our shift lead, Cora Dung, standing in the propped open doorway with her own handheld held out away from her ear, turning it over in her hand. And even from across the lot, I could read the moment she stopped troubleshooting it and understood it wasn't the radio. And I understood, standing there with a dead brick of plastic in my fist, that we were about to have the worst afternoon of our lives, with no way to call for help and no way to drive out of it. Because whatever had killed the engines out on the line had reached back and killed ours too. The fleet SUVs in the secondary yard, 6 of them, government white with a green stripe, sat dark and silent with their doors we'd left open, ticking cool in a heat that should have had them running hot. 42 miles to the nearest town of any real size. In August, in a bowl of desert with no radio and no vehicle and no shade except what we'd built ourselves. And a man screaming that he could feel it in his shoulder now. God, it was in his shoulder. Somebody help him, please. He could feel it going toward his heart. And the terrible flat certainty in his voice that nobody was going to. Cora crossed the lot at a dead run, which told me plenty, because Cora didn't panic. And Cora didn't hurry unless hurrying was the correct tactical choice. She was younger than me, 36, compact and quick, 4 years Army before she came to the service. The kind of person who kept a laminated card of emergency protocols in her breast pocket and had actually read the whole thing, not just skimmed it for the test. She reached us and took one hard look at Voss and did the thing they train the good ones to do, which is impose order on chaos by narrating it out loud so everyone's ears have something to hold on to besides the screaming. "Everybody stays with their vehicle," she called out, loud, flat, pitched to carry to the back of the line, without sounding scared. "Do not congregate. Do not touch each other. Stay by your own car. Officers, I want a head count. Civilians, lane by lane. Work back from primary. Ruben." She dropped her voice for me alone. "What's the tower doing?" "Tower's dead," I said. "Everything's dead. Even the beacon." She heard what that meant faster than I had. I watched it land. Her face didn't crumple. It went still, the way a pond goes still. And the stillness was worse than a flinch would have been. "The beacon's on the isolated circuit," she said. "I know. That circuit doesn't share anything with the grid. It's got its own battery, its own everything. It's designed to survive a strike, a surge, an outage. I know, Cora. She was quiet for a second, and behind us, Terrence Voss stopped screaming. And the silence where the screaming had been was so much worse than the screaming itself that both of us turned around at the same time. He had slumped back against the door of the Tahoe with his gray arm cradled against his chest. His wife was on her knees beside him, with both hands pressed flat over her own mouth, not touching him, obeying him even now. The gray had reached his throat. He was breathing in little sips, quick and shallow, staring at nothing over the roofs of the dead cars. And then he stopped doing even that, went slack against the door with his eyes still open. Dana Whitmer, the nurse, was already moving toward him with her orange kit banging against her thigh, and Cora stepped into her path and caught her by the arm. "Dana, don't touch him." "He's coding, Cora. I am not going to stand in a parking lot and watch a man." "You don't know what that is. Nobody on this earth knows what that is." Cora's voice didn't rise. That was the thing I came to understand about her over those 4 days. She got quieter the worse it got, dropped it down until you had to lean in, which made everybody around her go quiet too, so they could hear. "Look at his hand. Look at the timeline. 4 minutes, Dana. You have never in your career seen anything move through a body in 4 minutes. You put your bare hands on that man's skin, and we don't just lose him. We lose you. And you're the only medical person I've got for 140 civilians. I'm not letting you touch it until we understand what it does." Dana stood there with the kit hugged against her chest, and I watched a woman who had spent her whole adult life running toward the sick and the dying do the single hardest thing her profession would ever ask of her, which was nothing. Her jaw worked, her eyes were wet, and she took one step back and then another, away from a dying man. And I respected her for it, and I hated watching it in equal measure. Terrence Voss died on the sun-softened asphalt of Lane 3 at approximately 2:21 in the afternoon, 7 minutes after every engine in the valley went silent, and the gray kept climbing his face after his chest went still, up over his slack jaw and toward his open eyes, which meant that whatever it was did not need him alive to keep doing what it did. It just needed him. We didn't run. That's the thing I most want you to understand about the first hour, because I think people hear a story like this and picture chaos, picture a stampede. There wasn't one. Nobody ran, because there was nowhere on earth to run to. 42 miles is a death sentence on foot in August, with no water and no shade. And the whole point of a checkpoint is that it's the only structure for miles in every direction. That's why they built it there. We were on an island, a small, hard island, in an ocean of heat. And so instead of running, we did the only thing you can do on an island, which is try to figure out how big it is, and what lives on it, and how long you can last. Cora organized us fast, and she organized us right. She sent 2 officers to walk the full length of the deadline and bring back a real count, not an estimate. She sent the 2 canine handlers, a heavy-set veteran named Paris, and a kid named Sol Van Trees, who was only 24 and 11 months on the job, to secure the perimeter fence and report anything moving out in the wash or the scrub. She sent Cliff to the generator shed to find out why our backup power hadn't cut in the way it was supposed to. And she sent me, because I knew every foot of that property better than anyone alive, to the comms room to find out whether there was any way at all left to reach the outside world. The admin building's lights were on. That was the first thing that gave me hope walking in, and then took it away by the time I reached the hallway. The building had power. Cool air was still trickling from the vents, weak but there. But the building's power came off the same isolated circuit as the tower beacon, wired that way years ago so the office wouldn't go dark in a grid failure and the tower beacon was dead. And those two things could not both be true. Could not. Unless the failure had never been a power failure at all. Unless something had reached into that circuit and killed the beacon specifically, the tall thing, the transmitting thing, while it left the low building alive. I stood in the fluorescent hum of that hallway, everything around me perfectly, mockingly normal. The water cooler gurgling, a coffee mug somebody had left on the counter. And out the window, a man lay dead in lane 3 under a sheet. Somebody had finally thrown over him. And I had the first clear feeling that afternoon that we were not up against an accident or a blackout or a weapon. We were up against something that was choosing. And whatever chooses, watches. The comms room was a windowless closet off the main office, a desk, 2 monitors, the base station for our radio net, the terminal for the microwave link to Tucson, all of it packed into a space you could barely turn around in. All of it was powered. All of it was on, humming, the little status LEDs glowing green and orange in the dark, and every piece of it was showing me nothing. The radio put out the flat, white hiss of a channel with no repeater standing behind it, the sound of shouting into a canyon with no far wall. The microwave terminal showed a green light for local power and a hard red for link, which meant our equipment was healthy and pointed right, and the far end had simply, quietly, stopped answering. I picked up the emergency landline, an old copper circuit we kept for exactly this kind of day, because copper doesn't care whether the grid is up. And I got a dial tone for half a second. A real dial tone that made my heart come up in my throat. And then it died in my ear, into a silence with no bottom to it. I pulled my personal cell out of my breast pocket. No service, which was normal out here. We lived in a dead spot and always had. But the phone itself worked. The screen came on. The clock counted forward. The battery showed 80%, which meant the thing at 2:14 had not been an EMP, because an EMP would have killed the phone in my pocket the same instant it killed the trucks. Whatever had happened was selective in a way that no natural thing in the world is selective. It picked. It killed engines and radios and the beacon and left phones and building lights alone, and I stood in that closet running the pattern over and over in my head, and could not make it resolve into anything I had a name for. Cliff found me in the comms room, maybe 15 minutes later. He had fresh grease worked into the creases of both hands, and a look on his face I had never seen there in the 11 years I'd known him. And Cliff Otero had a face that had seen a great deal and been surprised by very little of it. "Generator won't start," he said, leaning in the doorway. "But here's the thing, Ruben. It ain't broke." "What's that mean?" "It's not broke." "Means I went through it. Fuel's full, batteries read good, every belt and hose and connection is exactly where it's supposed to be. I hit the start, and the starter motor turns the engine over strong. I mean, it spins right up, and the engine won't catch. It won't fire." He held his greasy hands out a little from his sides, palms up, like a man showing you he's not hiding anything. "That's a diesel, Ruben. Big Cummins, no spark plugs, no distributor, no computer worth speaking of. It runs on compression and fuel and nothing else. You spin it fast enough, the air in the cylinder gets hot enough to light the diesel on its own. That's the whole principle. There is no reason on God's earth a diesel won't catch when the starter's turning it over that hard. Unless." He stopped. Unless what? Unless something's stopping the fuel from burning, right there in the cylinder. Same reason every one of those cars out there died at once. It ain't the electronics, or the phone in your pocket would be dead too. It's the fire itself. Something in the air out here is stopping fire. He looked down at his own hands. "I've been fixing engines for 50 years since I was a kid in my daddy's shop, and I'm standing here telling you the one thing I know for certain, which is that I don't know a damn thing." Something was stopping combustion inside the bubble. That was the shape of it, laid out plain by the one man among us qualified to lay it out. No fire, no engines, and a man's living flesh turning to gray stone in 4 minutes flat. I did not understand how those two things joined. But I knew in my bones that they were the same thing, seen from two sides. And I filed it away in the front of my mind, where I keep the things that matter. And I want you to file it away too. Because it came back around later, and it mattered more than anything else in this whole story. The two officers came back from walking the line with the Count, both of them soaked through. One of them, a young woman named Ojeda, having already emptied her canteen down a heat-sick toddler in the 4th lane. 68 civilian vehicles in the queue. 141 people, ranging from an 8-month-old in a car seat to a couple in their 80s in a maroon Buick near the very back of the line who wouldn't get out of the car. 31 of us. 172 souls all told. Not one working engine among them. No radio, no phone that could reach past the valley wall. On an island 42 miles across in the worst heat of the worst month of the year. With one dead man under a sheet that nobody could move, because nobody could touch him. If you've ever been in a situation where the rules you built your whole life around had just quietly stopped applying. Drop a line in the comments and tell me where you were and how you kept your feet under you. Because I have spent the years since thinking hard about how people behave when the floor drops out. And I still don't fully understand what I saw. Cora gathered the officers in the break room while the civilians stayed by their cars under Paris's eye. She stood at the head of the long laminate table where we ate our lunches and filled out our reports. And I watched her go down her laminated protocol card line by line and realize, in real time, that not one entry on it applied to a single thing that had happened. There is no federal protocol for what we had. There's a protocol for a mass casualty event, and a protocol for a power failure, and a protocol for a civil disturbance, and one for a hazmat spill. And she read them all in her head in about 10 seconds. And I saw her put the card back in her pocket. And that small motion frightened the room more than anything she could have said. "Here's what we know," she said, quiet so the whole table leaned in. At 2:14, every engine and most electronics inside an area we haven't measured yet stopped. It's not electrical because Ruben's phone works and Cliff's generator turns over. Something is suppressing combustion. Fire. In that same window, a civilian died of something that discolors and hardens living tissue in about 4 minutes, and kept going after his heart stopped. We have no comms. The landline had a dial tone for half a second and then died, which Ruben will tell you is worse news than no dial tone at all. We have no transport. We have water for a couple days if we ration hard, and shade, and a building we can defend against the sun, if nothing else. Nobody's coming, because nobody knows. And listen to this part, because it's the part I need every one of you to sit with. The microwave link to Tucson didn't fail on our end. Our end is green. It failed on theirs. Their end stopped answering. She let that hang in the cool, recycled air. So think about what that means. Nobody said anything. So I said it, because I was the second senior person in the room, and somebody had to put it into words. It means the bubble's bigger than us, I said. It means Tucson's dark too, or the relay station between here and Tucson is inside whatever this is. Either way, the map we're standing on just got a whole lot bigger than this station, and there's a piece of it out there we can't see. We don't know that for certain, Paris said, folding his big arms. He wanted it to be smaller. Everyone did. We don't, Cora agreed. Ruben's right that we can't assume it's only us. And we can't assume it's the whole state either. What we know is their end stopped answering. And the smart, survivable play is to assume no rescue is coming and to act like it, and be pleasantly surprised if we're wrong. She looked around the table, meeting every set of eyes in turn, the way good leaders do when they're about to ask people to do a hard thing. So here's the plan. We hold here. We keep 140 scared civilians calm and hydrated and out of the sun. We find out how far this thing goes and which way it's moving. And we figure out what killed that man before it kills anyone else. Because I do not believe for 1 second that it is finished with us. She was right about that last part. It was not finished, but it did not come the way any one of us in that break room expected it to come. And the reason it didn't is the part of this I have turned over in my hands every day since. The first thing we did right was measure the bubble. And the first thing measuring it taught us was that it was alive, that it moved, that it had a shape, and the shape was growing. Cliff had the idea, and it was so simple it almost sounded stupid when he said it. He took a highway flare out of the emergency kit in the admin building, the kind you crack and strike like an enormous match, and he walked out into the middle of the parking lot and struck it. Nothing. You could see the little sparks jump off the striker cap, bright even in the sun, and the flare would not catch. He struck it again. Nothing. Then he started walking west toward the fence line and the wash, striking it fresh every 10 paces, counting his steps out loud. And for 140 yards, it threw sparks and refused to light. And then on one strike, one ordinary strike no different from the 40 before it, the flare roared up in his hand, bright red and hissing and spitting, throwing that ugly chemical light and a rope of gray smoke. Cliff stood there 140 yards from the admin building, holding a burning flare at arm's length, and looked back at all of us with an expression I can only call grim satisfaction. The look of a man who has hated a mystery and finally gotten one finger on the edge of it. "Line's right about here," he called back. "Fire works from here on out. Doesn't work from here back in." So we mapped it, because Cora understood immediately that a line you can't see is a line you have to draw before it kills someone. 2 officers with fistfuls of flares walked the whole perimeter of the property and out beyond it into the scrub, striking flares and marking the ground with orange spray paint at every spot where fire started catching. It took the better part of an hour in that heat, and it nearly put the older of the 2 officers on the ground with heat sickness. And Dana had to pull him into the shade and pour water into him. But by 4 o'clock, we had a rough circle drawn in orange paint and boot scuffs across the desert floor. And the circle told us something none of us wanted to know. It was not centered on the station. The dry wash west of the property, the one that only ran 3 days a year, sat almost exactly in the dead center of the bubble. The whole dead zone was maybe a 1/4 mile across, and the wash was its heart. And the station was off to the east edge of it, which was pure dumb luck, and the only luck we got. When Saul Van Treese, the young handler, walked the sandy bed of the wash itself with a flare that wouldn't light, he came back the color of paper, his dog straining backward against the leash the whole way. And he told us there was something down in the middle of it. Not a body, not an animal. He said the sand in the center of the wash was wrong, that there was a patch of it maybe 15 feet across, where the surface had a sheen to it like frost in a 102-degree afternoon, and that his dog, a 2-year-old Malinois that would go into anything, had locked all 4 legs and refused to take another step, and that when Saul himself got within 30 feet of it, his teeth had started to ache down in the roots, and his flare had died in his hand like a snuffed candle. I went down to see it myself, because part of me didn't believe him. A kid 11 months on the job. And part of me knew that if I was going to ask a 24-year-old to walk toward something, I had better have walked toward it first. Cora came with me. We left the flares behind, since flares were useless down there anyway. And we walked down the sloping bank into the wash in the long, flat gold light of late afternoon, our boots sinking into the soft sand. And Saul had been right about all of it, an understated half. The patch of sand had a sheen in that heat. And when we got close, it wasn't frost, because the air over it wasn't cold. It was still, absolutely dead still. The kind of stillness you feel in the pit of your stomach, like standing inside a sealed jar that had been sealed a very long time. There was a smell coming off it, and I have never once, in all the years since, been able to describe that smell to anyone in a way that lands. Not rot, not chemical, not exactly. The closest I've come is that it smelled like the half second after you strike a match and before the sulfur really catches, that sharp mineral bite, except drawn out and sourceless, and living in the very back of my throat and up behind my eyes. My teeth began to ache exactly the way Saul had said. A deep, dull pulse in the jaw. And in the center of the sheened patch of sand, half buried, half swallowed, was a piece of something. I want to be careful here, because I've caught myself telling this part wrong in the past, dressing it up, making it more than it was because more is a better story. It was not a monster. It was not a machine with lights on it. It was a piece of dull, gray material about the size and shape of a truck battery, with a texture like cooled slag, like something that had been heated past melting and then let harden all rough and pitted. And it was sunk into the sand at an angle, the way a stone sinks into mud, as if it had come down out of the sky at tremendous speed and buried the leading edge of itself. Radiating out from it in the sand were scorch marks, black and fresh and star-shaped, which meant the thing had burned when it hit, had come down hot, before the field started, before combustion stopped working in that valley. And the color of it, that dull, dead gray, was the exact gray of Terence Voss's arm. There was no mistaking it. It was the same gray. Cora crouched at the very edge of the sheened sand and did not reach out, because she was smarter than her fear. And she studied that piece of slag for a long time in silence. And then she said low, "It came down. Whatever it is, it fell here, right here. And it's putting out some kind of field. And the field stops fire and does that to living tissue. And the field centered on the thing, which means the closer you get, the worse it is." She stood up slow, her knees cracking. Voss was in lane 3. Lane 3 is the lane closest to the wash. He wasn't the first to die because he was unlucky. He was the first because he was the nearest to it. It reached him first. I understood, standing there in the wash with my teeth aching and that match smell crawling around behind my face, that the bubble was not a static thing we could simply hunker down and wait out. Because if the field's strength dropped off with the distance, and the people nearest it were dying, then the only question that actually mattered for 172 lives was whether the field was getting bigger. And I looked down at those fresh, star-shaped scorch marks, and I looked at the sheen on the sand, and I looked at Saul, standing up on the bank, pointing at a paint mark he'd sprayed 40 minutes earlier that was now a good 4 feet inside the sheen, and I had my answer, and it was the answer I did not want. We backed out of the wash slow, together, not turning our backs on it, and we did not run. And the instant we crossed up over the lip of the bank and out of the dead zone, my teeth stopped aching so suddenly and so completely that I sucked in a breath like a man surfacing from deep water. Cora put her hand flat on my shoulder, which she had never done in 4 years of working beside me, and said, "We tell them it's expanding, all of them. We do not lie to these people about which way it's moving. They'll figure it out on their own inside a day. And the second they catch us in one lie, they'll never believe a true thing we say again. And then we've lost them. And a crowd we've lost is more dangerous than the field. That was the second thing we did right. And it was very nearly the last easy decision any of us got to make. We told them. Cora climbed up onto the hood of the dead lead vehicle at the front of the line so that 140 frightened civilians could see her and hear her. And she gave it to them straight, in plain, flat words, no jargon, no comfort she couldn't back up. Something had fallen out of the sky into the wash. It was killing anything living that got too close to it. And it was slowly growing bigger, spreading outward a few feet an hour. The safe area was shrinking from the west side inward. The vehicles nearest the wash needed to be abandoned right now, and their people walked back east on foot toward the admin building, which sat at the far eastern edge of the bubble, the single farthest point from the thing. We had water and we had shade, and we would share both. Help would come because a dead zone this large, one that took down a federal checkpoint and cut the microwave link to a sector office, would not go unnoticed for long by the people whose job it was to notice such things. We would stay together, and we would fall back east, foot by foot, as the edge came for us. And we would buy time until someone came. It was a good speech. Most of it was even true. And it held them. Through the rest of that first brutal day and through the first night, which was its own particular kind of hell. 172 people crowded into and around a building built for 30, in near total darkness because we didn't dare run the building lights. Not knowing whether light drew the field the way it seemed to draw nothing else. Everyone listening to the wind and to each other breathe, and to the old woman in the maroon Buick, who refused for hours to leave her husband in the car until Sol Ventris finally carried her the last quarter mile to safety on his back in the dark, her thin arms locked around his neck, both of them not saying a word. The thing I keep coming back to, the thing I have never fully forgiven myself for, is that we spent that entire first day and night with our eyes on the wash. Every one of us, every officer, every civilian who could bear to look. We watched the thing in the sand, watched the frost sheen creep outward foot by foot, and we moved people back ahead of it. Because that was the threat, that was the enemy, that was the thing we could see and point at and measure with spray paint. And the whole time we were all facing west toward the wash. The danger that actually undid us was standing behind us in the admin building with a clipboard and a kind voice, helping. I need to tell you about our water now, because the water is where the whole thing turned over. And I need you to understand exactly how much of it there was and exactly how it worked, or the rest won't sit right. The San Marcos station kept a bulk water supply for the obvious reason. We processed human beings in the open desert, and sometimes those human beings arrived to us 3/4 dead from 3 days in the brush with an empty milk jug. And when that happened, we had to be able to put water into a lot of bodies very fast. So we had a 1,500-gallon polyethylene tank standing on a concrete pad behind the admin building, topped up once a month by a tanker truck out of Green Valley, plus a whole bank of bottled water in the storeroom for the fleet and the staff. Cases and cases of it stacked to the ceiling. In normal times, it was far more water than we could ever use, and half the bottled stock was always past the date printed on it, not that water goes bad. With 172 people drinking in August heat, though, Cora sat down the first night with a pencil and did the arithmetic on the back of her useless protocol card. And she found me alone at the edge of the light and told me quiet, so no one else would hear, that the tank plus the bottled stock gave us maybe 5 days if we rationed hard and ugly. 6 if nobody did any physical work at all and everyone lay still in shade. Neither of those was a real scenario, but that was the ceiling. 5 days, and the field expanding at maybe 2 feet an hour, which meant that in something like 10 days, it would reach the admin building itself and swallow our last shelter. And long before that, days before that, it would reach the water tank, because the tank sat on its pad between the building and the wash, on the wrong side of us, west of the building, closer to the thing, which meant that on night 1, standing in the dark at the edge of the lantern light, Cora and I had already worked out the real shape of what was coming. And it was worse than the number she'd said out loud. We did not have 5 days of water. We had 4 at the outside, because on the 4th day, the expanding field would reach the tank and put it behind the wall. And you cannot drink water that's inside the dead zone. And a 1,500-gallon poly tank full of water is not a thing 4 men can pick up and carry. And even if you could carry it, there was nowhere to carry it that the field wouldn't eventually reach. Our true number was 4 days, and the only forces on Earth that could change that number were rain, which the sky was not offering, or rescue, which we'd agreed not to count on, or getting the water out of that tank and moved east before the field could reach it. That last one became the plan, and it was a good plan. We would drain the bulk tank into every container on the property over the next 2 or 3 days, working steady, and cache all that water at the far eastern end of the yard, buying ourselves the extra days the tank's position would otherwise steal. Cliff rigged a gravity siphon off the tank's bottom valve with a length of garden hose, and we started filling everything that held liquid, the cases of empty bottles once we drank them, plastic jugs, the big orange 5-gallon coolers from the break room, a 50-gallon steel drum out of the maintenance shed that Cliff scrubbed clean. It was slow sweating work under the canopy in the heat, and it was the single most important labor on the whole island. And Cora understood that a job that important needed one steady, clear-headed person in charge of it. One person to log every gallon and ration it out fairly, because water shared unfairly is how a scared crowd turns into a mob. She put Dana Whitmer in charge of the water. I want to be fair to Dana here, even now, even after everything. She was the nurse. She was the one person on that property with real medical training. And hydration in the desert is not a comfort. It is medicine. It is the difference between a living person and a dead one. And so putting the water under the person whose entire profession was keeping bodies alive made complete, obvious sense. Cora made the right call with the information she had in front of her. I stood right there and signed off on it with a nod. If you had been there that night, you would have signed off on it too. Dana Whitmer was calm and competent and organized. She had watched a man turn to gray stone on the first afternoon, and she had done the hard discipline thing and backed away when Cora told her to. She was, by every single measure available to any of us that night, exactly the person you would want holding the most precious resource on the island. And she held it for 2 days, like the professional she was. She kept a log in a spiral notebook, times and amounts initialed. She rationed by body weight and by age, more for the infant and the 2 remaining elderly, more for the officers doing physical labor in the sun, less for the sedentary. And here's the part that mattered most. The part that bought her 3 days of everyone's trust. She visibly took less for herself. In front of people. She'd pour a short measure into her own cup and drink it slow in the open where the crowd could watch her do it. The nurse going thirsty so a stranger's child didn't have to. And there is no single thing on this earth that steadies a frightened crowd faster than watching the person in charge sacrifice first. By the end of the 2nd day, I trusted Dana Whitmer more than almost anyone else out there. I had stopped watching her entirely. I was watching the wash, like every other fool on that property. On the morning of the 3rd day, 2 things happened close together, and I didn't connect them until it was far too late to matter. The first was that the old man from the maroon Buick, the 80-something husband, died in the night. Not from the field. He'd been moved to the safe East End that first evening on Saul's back. He died the plain way that old men die when they are pushed too hard and too much heat with too little water, quietly, in his sleep, on a cot in the corner of the break room with his wife's hand folded in his. Dana pronounced him, gently, and closed his eyes. And when she came out of that room into the gray dawn light, she was carrying his water ration in her 2 hands, the 2 bottles that had been allotted to a man who would not drink them now, carrying them back to be returned to the general stock, which was exactly the correct and decent thing to do. And I remember watching her cross the yard with those 2 bottles and thinking what a good and sturdy soul she was. To be thinking of the stock and the living at a moment when she'd just closed a dead man's eyes. The second thing was that Cliff Otero, who had gone to check on the half-drained bulk tank to see how close the field's edge had crept to it overnight, came and found me by the canopy and said, "Lo, only for me. Ruben, the count's wrong." "What count?" "The water. I've been running that siphon 3 days now. I know to the gallon how much we started with in that tank because I read the sight gauge on the side of it the first afternoon and wrote it down. I know the rate we've been drawing it off. Do the arithmetic, and there should be a lot more water in those caches on the East End than there is. A lot more, Ruben. Somebody's numbers don't add up. And it ain't my numbers because I only got the one job, and I do it right." I told him he was wrong. I stood there in the heat, and I gave Cliff Otero 4 good reasons why he was wrong. And I believed every one of them while I said them, because I badly wanted to. I told him the heat made every person out here drink well past their ration when nobody was looking. That a man will sneak water. I told him the evaporation off the open coolers in this sun was murderous, that we were probably losing gallons a day to the air. I told him 170 people go through more than his gut estimate could track. I told him a siphon rate is never as steady as it feels. 4 reasons, and all 4 were partly true, and none of them was the true reason, which was the 5th one, the one I would not let myself pick up and look at. Cliff heard me out. Then he looked at me the exact way he'd looked at me over the diesel that wouldn't catch, patient and unmoved, and he said, "I'm a maintenance man, Ruben. My whole working life is knowing how much of a thing there's supposed to be, and then finding out where the rest of it went when there isn't. That's the whole job. That's plumbing and its fuel and its parts inventory and its water. And I'm telling you, standing here, the rest of that water went somewhere. Water doesn't lie, and it doesn't evaporate into a number that big. Somebody moved it. So I checked. I did it quietly, and I did it alone, because I understood the size of what I was doing. If Cliff was right and word got loose, we would have 140 desperate, thirsty people turning on each other and on us in the space of an hour. And if Cliff was wrong, I would have privately accused a good woman of the single worst crime possible on that island. And I would have to carry that. So I went to the storeroom in the middle of the day on the excuse of doing a head count of the bottled stock. And I counted the bottles against the running number in Dana's spiral notebook, slow and careful, twice. The notebook said we had 190 bottles left in the storeroom. I counted 190 bottles. Exactly. And a wash of relief went through me so strong that my knees actually went soft, and I had to put a hand on a shelf. And I very nearly walked back out into the sun and told Cliff to let it go. That the man was tired and seeing shortages where there was only heat. And then I stood still in the cool dark of that storeroom, and I made myself think about what Cliff had actually said, which was not about the bottles at all. It was about the total, about the rate, about the tank. The bottles matched because the log matched the bottles. Of course they did. Dana kept both the bottles and the log. If a person is going to skim, they do not skim from the pile that other people can walk in and count. They skim from the one thing that only they can see the true amount of. The bulk tank. The 1,500 gallons we'd been siphoning off into the caches for 3 days. Nobody on that property had a running total of what came out of that tank. And where it went, except Dana Whitmer, because Dana was in charge of the water. And the water was the one single thing all 31 of us had agreed to stop watching so that we could watch the wash instead. I walked out to the east end of the yard, past the canopy, into the maze of dead vehicles we'd pushed and rolled, into a rough wall to throw shade. I found the 50-gallon steel drum from the maintenance shed sitting where it should be, behind a jackknifed panel van. And I put my hand on it and rocked it. And it barely moved, near empty, 3/4 gone, when it should have been dead full, because I had personally stood there on the afternoon of the second day and watched Cliff top it off to the brim and thump the lid on. And then, 10 feet farther back, tucked deep into a gap between a wrecked sedan and the van, in a spot you would only find if you had walked back there specifically looking for a place to hide something, were 4 of the big orange 5-gallon coolers. All 4 were full to the caps, and not one of the 4 appeared anywhere in Dana Whitmer's log. 20 gallons of water, hidden, uncounted, set aside from the general stock, in a place 140 thirsty people would never look, by the one person every one of us had trusted to keep them all alive. I stood there in that furnace of dead metal, with my hand resting on the cap of a cooler that was not supposed to exist. And I did the same arithmetic Cora had done on the first night. Except now, I did it with the real numbers. The numbers that included 20-some gallons quietly bled off the caches into a private stash. And the real numbers were worse than anyone's estimate, because the water we all believed was going east into the common cache had partly been going sideways into Donna's, which meant our 4 days was never 4 days. Our 4 days was closer to 2.5, and one of those was already spent and gone. Here is the part that still, all these years later, gets me up out of bed at 3 in the morning. I understood immediately why she had done it, and understanding it turned out to be so much worse than not understanding it would have been. Dana Whitmer had watched a man turn to gray stone in 4 minutes on the first afternoon. She had sat by an old man's cot on the 3rd night and watched him die of nothing but thirst and heat. Watched it up close, the way only a nurse does. She had done the exact same arithmetic the rest of us had done. 4 days and 172 people. And she had looked at that number. And somewhere in the quiet of her own head, she had made a decision, the way she did everything, without noise or drama, that not all of these people were going to walk off this island alive, and that she was going to be one of the ones who did. She was not a monster. I need you to hear that, because it's the whole point. She was a woman who had decided to survive, and who happened to hold the position and the trust and the plain intelligence to arrange her own survival quietly. And she had arranged it while looking every one of us square in the eye, while giving the baby extra, while drinking short in the open so a crowd could take comfort from her thirst. The public sacrifice had not been a lie. That was what made it monstrous. It was cover. She could afford to drink short in front of us all because she had 20 gallons waiting behind a dead sedan for when the cameras of everyone's attention finally went dark. I did not confront her in the open. And I want to be honest that this was not wisdom. It was fear, plain and cold. 140 civilians who learned that the nurse had been stealing the water were not going to convene a hearing. So instead I went and quietly got Cora, and I got Cliff, and I walked the 2 of them back through the dead cars to the drum and the coolers, And I showed them, and I watched Cora's face do the thing it did when it got very bad, which was go still, that pond stillness, while behind her eyes something worked fast. "How much?" she said. 20 gallons in these 4 coolers that I found," I said. "The drum's 3/4 gone, and it should be full. I don't know how long she's been at it, or whether there's more stashed somewhere I haven't found." Cora crouched down by the coolers the exact way she'd crouched at the edge of the sheen sand in the wash, looking at a thing that quietly rearranged everything. Cliff stood over us both with his arms folded and his jaw muscle working under the weathered skin. And he didn't say "I told you so," which I've always respected him for. "The field reaches the tank tomorrow morning," Cora said, still crouched, still looking at the coolers. "Midday at the absolute latest, and it's been speeding up, so probably sooner. Everything still in that tank is lost the second the sheen touches the pad. That puts our real deadline at tomorrow, maybe tomorrow night if we're lucky with the wind. After tomorrow night, the only water on this earth we can reach is whatever's already in the caches out here." She stood up, and her voice stayed low and even, but there was something underneath it now, something with an edge. "And she's been bleeding the caches into her own stash this whole time. So the number I gave those people from the hood of that car, 5 days, 4 days, it was never real. Our actual number is that we run dry sometime tomorrow." And I built the entire plan. I stood up in front of 140 terrified people and told them a number. And the number was a lie. And it was a lie because I handed the one thing that mattered to a woman who was lying to my face, with a straight back and a steady hand the whole time. Now you have made it with me this far into it. I want to ask you something. And I want you to actually sit with it a moment before you type anything. Because I have never once landed on a clean answer myself in all the years I've had to try. If you had been the one to find those coolers, 20 gallons of stolen water, hidden by the one person every soul on the island trusted, in a place where 140 people were now 2 days from dying of thirst, what would you have done in that first minute, before your rational mind caught up to your body? I know exactly what I wanted to do in that first minute. I'm not proud of it, and I've never said it out loud, and I won't now. We did not get to decide it in the calm of that shaded corner, though, because while the 3 of us stood there staring down at 4 orange coolers, the field did the thing Cora had feared most, and it did it a full day ahead of the worst case she'd drawn up. The wind shifted at dusk on the 3rd day. It had been blowing steady out of the south the whole time, a slow, hot push coming up off the border, the same wind we lived in 9 months of the year. And right at dusk, as the sun went fat and red behind the Babokivari Range far to the west, the wind swung around hard, came around to the west, blowing straight in off the wash, straight across the top of the thing half buried in the sand. And it carried that struck match smell up across the entire property all at once. 140 people flinched and grabbed at their jaws at the same moment as their teeth began to ache. And the sheen on the sand, which had been creeping outward at its patient 2 feet an hour, jumped. I don't have a better word for it than jumped. And I've looked for one for years. Sol Van Treese was posted on the west perimeter with his dog when it happened. And he came sprinting back east through the maze of dead cars. No calm in him now, screaming that the edge was moving, it was moving fast, that the frost sheen had crossed 40 feet of open ground in about a minute and a half. Cliff struck a flare to check the line where he stood, and the flare that had lit fine that same morning 200 yards farther east would not catch in his hand, would only throw dying sparks. And the maintenance shed he was standing beside had been well outside the dead zone an hour before. The bubble had not simply expanded on its slow schedule. It had lunged. And it had lunged east, toward the admin building, toward the caches, toward the 140 people we had carefully packed into the safe end, precisely because the safe end was supposed to have days of margin left in it. and it reached the bulk water tank while we stood there watching it come. The 1,500-gallon poly tank on its concrete pad behind the admin building, the tank that still held 400 or 500 gallons in its bottom that we had not finished siphoning out, went inside the dead zone at maybe 8 o'clock that evening. I know the hour almost to the minute, because Cliff had rigged a battery work lantern over the siphon rig so the fill crew could keep working after dark. And the lantern went black, just went out mid-shine. And a woman named Escobar, who'd been filling a jug at the rig, dropped it and started screaming that her hands hurt. Her hands were cold. They were burning cold. And Paris got a fistful of her collar and hauled her backward out of the leading edge of the field by main strength. And her hands were fine. She'd only been inside it a second or two. But for that second or two, the field had been on her living skin, and the tank was gone. Behind the wall now. Everything in it, all 400 or 500 gallons, sealed off from us as completely as if it had been sunk to the bottom of the sea. So here is exactly where we stood, on the night of the third day. And I'm going to lay it out plain the way Cora would have. 168 of us left alive, after Voss and the old man, and one heat-stroke death in the second lane that first afternoon that I haven't dwelt on. The field had lunged east and swallowed the bulk tank a full day early, cutting the total supply Cora had planned around by 400 or 500 gallons in the space of one wind shift. The only drinkable water left anywhere on the island was what sat in the caches at the far east end, behind the wall of dead cars. And that cache had been quietly skimmed for 3 days by the one person put in charge of it. So even the caches held meaningfully less than the notebook claimed. Our 4 days had become, in one turning of the wind, something like one. A day and a half if the field slowed back down to its old creep, which it showed no sign whatsoever of doing. And there was one more thing. And this is the thing that turned the whole night over onto its back, the thing I have never once told cleanly, because it's the hinge, everything after it swings on. When the field lunged east and took the tank, it also took the generator shed, because the generator shed stood right next to the tank pad, and the generator shed shared a berm with the fuel depot. And the fuel depot was where Cliff Otero had staged the one thing on that entire property that might have gotten a single one of us off the island alive. Because Cliff, quietly, working the problem the way a good maintenance man works any problem, on his own time, in the margins of the 2 days while the rest of us moved bodies and rationed water and stared at the wash, had figured out something about the field that not one of the rest of us had thought through. And he had been building toward a way out, and he had staged that way out beside the fuel depot. And now the fuel depot was inside the dead zone. Let me back up one step because you have to understand what Cliff had worked out or none of the rest will land. The field stopped combustion. No fire, no engines. We knew that from the first hour. And Cliff had spent his whole life inside the logic of engines. And he could not simply accept it and move on the way the rest of us had. So on the second day, in between his real jobs, he'd run little experiments, quiet ones, that nobody paid much mind to at the time. And he'd found something the rest of us missed. The field did not stop all of chemistry. It stopped fast oxidation, specifically. Fire, explosion, the violent, fast-release stuff. But slow chemistry still worked fine inside the bubble. A battery still held its charge and still delivered current. Cliff proved it with a flashlight and a multimeter. And most important of all, Cliff found that stored energy that didn't need combustion to release. Electricity, compressed air, a wound spring, all of it still functioned inside the dead zone exactly the way it functioned outside. And then Cliff had walked the whole fleet in his head and found the one vehicle on the entire property that did not run on combustion. It was a little electric utility cart, a glorified beefed-up golf cart, that the day shift used to run paperwork and parts between the admin building and the far end of the secondary yard. Battery-powered, electric motor, no engine, no fuel, no fire anywhere in it. On the first afternoon, when every engine in the valley died at 2:14, the electric cart had died right along with them, because its little computerized speed controller had been fried in the initial event, whatever that event was. The same instant, it killed the tower beacon. But the cart's batteries were fine. Cliff had tested them. The battery chemistry still worked perfectly. So Cliff had spent his stolen hours on the second and third days rebuilding that cart's controller by hand, out of heavy relays and switches and copper bar scavenged from the dead fleet vehicles, bypassing the fried electronic controller entirely, wiring the batteries straight to the drive motor through a simple, brutal, manual knife switch, because a physical knife switch has no electronics in it to fry, and no combustion in it to suppress. And it will close a circuit inside the field the same as anywhere. Cliff Otero had built us a vehicle that would run inside the dead zone. It wasn't fast, maybe 10, 12 miles an hour flat out. It wasn't going to carry 168 people. But it would carry 2, maybe 3 at a squeeze, slowly along the inside edge of the field and out past the western or northern rim to where the world still worked, to where a running engine would run, and a phone might find a bar of signal up on the ridge, and a person could simply be somewhere the field was not. From the edge of the field, it was still 42 miles to town, but it was 42 miles you could relay in shifts, or a ridge you could climb to be seen, or simply out. And out was everything. Out was the whole ballgame. Cliff had built the one machine on Earth that could cross the wall both ways, and he'd staged it, all but finished, in the shelter of the fuel depot berm on the evening of the third day, maybe an hour before the wind swung west and the field lunged east and swallowed the fuel depot whole. The cart was inside the dead zone now, and a half-finished electric cart, its hand-built controller not yet fully wired in, sitting inside a field that killed living tissue in minutes and had killed Terrence Voss in 4, might as well have been sitting on the surface of the moon. Unless a living person walked in there and got it. We stood in the dark by the dead cars, the 4 of us who knew the whole of it now, me and Cora and Cliff and Sol Vantries, who'd pieced together most of it on his own from watching Cliff work. And Cliff laid it out flat, the way he laid out everything. The cart's maybe 20 feet inside the current edge, he said. Field's growing, so that number's getting worse by the hour. The controller's 90% done. I need about 4 minutes of hands-on work to land the last connections and close the main switch, and then it drives under its own power. I can walk it out steering from a standing start. 4 minutes inside the field. Voss died in 4 minutes, Cora said. Voss was in the heart of it, down in the wash, right on top of the thing in the sand. That's the deep end. 20 feet inside the outer edge is the shallow end. Sol was 30 feet in this afternoon and got his teeth aching and walked out on his own 2 feet and slept fine. Cliff's jaw worked. I ain't telling you it's safe. I'm telling you it's 4 minutes at the shallow edge against certain death for 168 people tomorrow when the water's gone. It's a bad bet laid against a worse one. That's the only kind of bet we got left to make. You're 63 years old, Cliff. And I built the thing with these hands. And I'm the only man alive who knows how the last of the wiring goes, so it's me. There's no argument in it. He said it the way he said everything, like the words were coming out of his own wallet. And that, as far as Cliff was concerned, was the end of the discussion. But it was not going to be the end of it, because that same night, while Cliff and I bent our heads together over how to get a 63-year-old man into and back out of a killing field in under 4 minutes, Dana Whitmer found out that I had found the coolers. I don't know how she knew. I've turned it over 100 ways. Maybe Cliff, tired, let something slip in her hearing. Maybe she went to check her stash in the night and saw the drum had been rocked and the coolers shifted an inch. Maybe she simply read it on my face across the yard, because reading faces was supposed to be my one gift. And it had never once occurred to me until far too late that a smart, cornered person might be reading mine right back, the whole time, better than I was reading hers. But sometime in the small black hours of that third night, while all four of us were bent over the problem of the cart and the field, Dana Whitmer bent over her own problem, and she solved it faster and cleaner than we solved ours, because our plan only had to account for the field, and hers had to account for people, and she understood people better than any of us. She understood before we did exactly what the cart meant. She understood that a slow electric cart, able to carry 2 or 3 bodies at a time out of the dead zone, was never going to make 60 round trips before the last cash ran dry. She understood that the cart was, in cold practice, a lifeboat with room for a handful, and that whoever controlled the lifeboat controlled who lived and who stayed behind to die of thirst in the heat. And she understood, with the clarity of the truly cornered, that she was already a dead woman the instant the crowd learned about the water, which meant her one and only path off that island was to be aboard the cart in the very first load, and gone before the truth about the coolers ever got out. So at first light on the 4th day, before Cliff and I had even choked down the handful of crackers that was breakfast, we walked out through the dead cars to the staged position to run the cart, and the cart was gone, not swallowed deeper into the field. Gone. There were drag marks gouged into the sand where a person had gone in and physically hauled it, dug in and dragged, the wheels leaving twin furrows, and the marks led east, out of the field. And they ended at the maintenance shed on the safe side, and the shed's roll door was pulled down and chained shut from the inside. When Cliff put his eye to the gap between the door and the frame, he went very still and very quiet, the stillest I ever saw him. And then he said, in a low, flat voice I had never once heard him use in 11 years, "She's got it. She dragged it out, and she's got it inside. And she's got my controller parts. And she's got the switch." Dana Whitmer had gone into the field herself, alone, in the dark before dawn, at the shallow edge, and she had dragged the cart out by hand. She had taken a dose of that thing into her own body to do it. And she was inside that shed right now, sick with it, and finishing the wiring that Cliff had all but finished. Because she'd watched him do the work for 2 days, and she was intelligent, and she had a copy of his diagrams. And she had chained the door from the inside, so that when the cart was done, she could throw the door up, drive it out, choose her passengers, and be gone across the desert before any of us could stop her. She had not merely stolen the water. She had stolen the only way off the island, and she had done it by walking of her own free will into the one thing on that island that could kill her, which meant she was either the most desperate human being on the property or the most coldly committed. And I have spent years failing to decide which of those is the more frightening thing to have been standing on the other side of a door from. Cliff talked to her through the door. That's the part of the whole 4 days I know I'll carry to the end. The picture of it. The two of them on either side of a chained steel roll door in the flat gray dawn light. An old maintenance man and the nurse who had stolen his lifeboat. And Cliff not raising his voice, because Cliff never once raised his voice, just saying, level and patient, "Dana, that controller's not grounded right. You watched me draw it, but you didn't watch me do the ground bond because I hadn't done it yet. You close that main switch the way you've got it wired, you're going to dump the whole battery bank through the steel frame of that cart. and you're going to be sitting on the frame when it goes. You'll cook, Dana. Open the door and let me land the ground the right way. And I swear to you on my mother's grave, I'll put you on the very first load out, first seat. And there was a long silence, the kind of silence that has a person breathing on the far side of it. And then Dana's voice came through the gap in the door. And here is the thing I could never square. She did not sound like a monster, not even a little. She sounded exhausted and scared, and absolutely, immovably certain, which is a worse combination than any villainy. She said, "You're lying about the ground, so I'll open the door. And even if you're not lying, Cliff, even if it's true, I would rather cook in here than walk back out there and watch what happens to 140 people when the last cooler runs dry. I've watched people die of thirst. I sat with that old man all night. I'm not doing it again 140 times over. I'm not. And I'm not going to stand up in front of them and pretend there's a plan when there's no plan." A pause, and then quieter, right against the door. "You want the truth of it? There's no ground problem. I did it right. I checked it 3 times. I'm going to drive this cart out of here in 20 minutes, and I'm going to take 3 people, and I'm going to go get help. Real help. People with trucks and water, and I'll send them back for the rest. That's the actual plan. That's the only plan that was ever real. From the first hour, everything else was you and Cora and Ruben keeping a crowd calm enough to die quiet. And the terrible thing, the thing that made Cliff step back off the door and turn and look at me in the gray light with something broken in his face, was that a part of what she said was simply mathematically true. A slow cart could only ever carry a few. One person getting clear and bringing back real help was, on paper, the only version of the whole story in which most of those people lived. Dana was not wrong about the shape of the solution. She was only wrong about who got to decide it and about the price of deciding it in secret. And she had made herself the one who decided by taking the water and taking the cart and chaining the door. And now she was inside with the only vehicle on the island. And the field was expanding toward the shed by the hour. And the last cash would run dry by nightfall. So here was the critical decision. And it fell to me because Cora was 300 yards east, holding a frightened crowd together with her voice and her stillness, and did not yet even know the cart was gone. And Cliff had built the machine, but he was frozen at that door with something broken in him. And Sol Von Treze was 24 years old, and looking at me the exact way you look at the oldest man in the room when the ground has opened up, and you need him more than you have ever needed anything. To know what to do next, I could break the door. We had bolt cutters in the shed's twin on the north side. We could cut that chain and take the cart back by main force, and Dana would fight us for it, because she was sick and cornered, and she truly believed she was right, which is the most dangerous thing a person can be. And in the fighting, the delicate hand-wired controller might get smashed. And the fuel depot's stored chemicals were staged all around that shed, useless as fuel inside the field, but not useless as poison. And the field's edge was close and coming closer. And I could count a dozen ways that ended with the cart destroyed and every last one of us dead. Or I could stand back and let her go. I could let Dana Whitmer drive the only lifeboat on the island off into the desert with 3 passengers of her own choosing, on the strength of a promise to send help back, made by a woman who had lied to my face with a steady hand for 3 straight days and skimmed water from an 8-month-old baby to save her own skin. Or I could try the third thing, the thing that put ice down the whole length of my spine, which was to talk. I told Saul to run and get Cora, quiet, no crowd. I told Cliff to fetch the bolt cutters from the north shed and stand ready with them, but under no circumstances to use them until I said so. And then I went to the gap in the door where Cliff had been, and I put my mouth close to the cold steel. And I did the only thing I have ever truly been good at in my whole life, which was to read a person down to the bone and then speak to them true. "Dana," I said. "It's Ruben. I found the coolers behind the panel van. 20 gallons. I know what you did, and I know why you did it. And I'm not going to stand out here and insult you by pretending I don't understand it, because I understand every part of it. I did the same math you did on the first night. 4 days, 170 people. I stood in the dark, and I looked at that number. And I'll tell you something I've never told another living soul. A part of me, in the dark, did exactly what you did, in my head. The whole thing. The only difference between you and me, Dana, is that you had the nerve to reach out your hand and do it, and I didn't. And I honestly do not know which one of us that makes the better person, and neither do you. So let's not either one of us pretend we're standing on higher ground than the other." Silence from the shed, but it was a listening silence now. I could feel it through the steel, the way you feel someone stop moving in a dark room. "Here's what's true," I said, keeping my voice as level and low as Cliff's, as Cora's, the register that made a person lean in instead of pull back. "You built the ground right. I believe you. You checked it 3 times. You're careful. You can drive that cart out of here alive. But listen to what happens if you drive out alone, or with 3 people you picked yourself this morning. The rest find out inside the hour. They find the coolers, because I'm going to have to tell Cora, and it gets out. These things always get out. And then 140 people who have just learned that the nurse stole their water and stole the only lifeboat are going to spend the last day of their lives on this earth hating the one person who might be able to save them. And they will not believe help is coming, Donna. Not for 1 second. Because why on God's earth would they? From where they'll be standing. They'll believe you left them to die out of the goodness of your heart. Because from where they stand, that's precisely what you'll have done. And when the help comes, if it comes back to a place where the only story left alive is that the government's own nurse ran and left everybody in the dirt. That's the story that outlives you. That's your name forever. You want to save people. I believe that you do. I've watched you drink short for 3 days, so a stranger's kid didn't have to. But you cannot save them by making yourself the villain of the last day of their lives. The chain rattled against the inside of the door. Not off. But her hand was on it now. I could hear her breathing, quick and shallow, the way Voss had breathed at the end. "So here's the deal, Dana. And it's the only one I've got the authority in this whole broken place to make," I said. "You open the door. Cliff lands the ground bond and checks every connection, because whether or not there's a problem, I am not sending one single human being out of here on a cart that only one sick person double-checked. And then we don't pick 3 people to save and leave the rest. We run it, round trips. At the shallow edge, along the line, Cliff and Saul can walk you, all day and all night, if that's what it takes. 2 at a time, oldest and youngest and sickest first. And yes, that means slow. And yes, it means that some of these people are not going to make it out before the last cooler runs dry. And yes, that is a horror I will see behind my eyes for the rest of my life. But it is a horror we do together. And out in the open, where everyone can watch us try. And the ones who don't make it will die knowing we were trying for them right up to the end, instead of dying while they watched us drive away. And you drive it, Dana. You. Because you were the one willing to walk into that field in the dark. And that took something the rest of us out here don't have. And we all know it. You want to be the person who saves people. Here's how. Not by being on the boat, by being the one who drives the boat over and over until there's nobody left to carry. It was the longest silence of my entire life, longer than the seconds after Voss stopped breathing. Somewhere behind me, Cora had come up quiet with Saul and was standing dead still, having heard enough of it through the last of the dawn to have the whole shape of it. And she did not say one word, which was its own kind of grace, letting me finish the thing I'd started. The wind was picking up again out of the west, and my teeth were beginning to ache, low and dull, which meant the field's edge was coming again, which meant I did not have the full day I was standing there promising her. And I think Dana knew that better than I did, because she was the only one of us who had been all the way inside it and felt exactly how fast it moved. Then the chain came off the door from the inside, link by link, and slid to the concrete. She had done the ground right. Cliff had the door up and was inside with his multimeter and his eye on the connections in under a minute. And he checked it in 90 seconds and looked up at me and gave one short nod. And I saw in his weathered face a kind of grief that had no bottom to it, because his nod meant she really could have driven out alone and clear this morning. And it would have worked. And she was standing there, giving that up with her own 2 hands. Her left hand was gray to the wrist from the time she'd spent in the field dragging the cart out in the dark, gray and stiffening at the knuckles. And she'd wrapped it in a torn shirt so that when she came out among the crowd, they wouldn't see it and understand. She looked down at the wrapped hand, and then she looked up at me, and she said flat and clear, "You understand I'm dead either way. This hand, I've watched it since before dawn. It doesn't stop. It doesn't slow down." Her voice did not shake, and that was somehow the worst part. I didn't take the water because I thought it would let me live. I took it because I could not stand to be the one holding the empty tank when it finally ran dry with 140 pairs of eyes on me, waiting for me to fix it. I'm the nurse. I'm the one who's supposed to fix it. And then she laughed. One small, awful, cracked sound with no humor anywhere in it, and said, "And I couldn't fix any of it. Not the field, not the man in lane 3, not the old man, not the water, not one single thing. So I stole it instead." That's the whole story, Ruben. That's everything I've got left to tell you. I have turned that over more times than I have turned over anything else in my life. She had not been hoarding water to survive, not in her own heart. She had been hoarding it because she could not bear to be the caregiver who stands empty-handed and watches everyone in her care die. And so she had quietly stopped trying to keep everyone alive and started trying to keep some of them alive, in secret, so that she would never have to be the one holding the dry tank in front of the crowd. The betrayal wasn't greed. It never was. It was a good person collapsing under a weight that no single set of shoulders should ever have been handed, the weight of choosing. And that does not make it right. It does not unmake it. 140 human beings were a full day closer to dying of thirst because of the 20 gallons she took and the trust she spent. But it is the truth of it, the real machinery underneath it. And I told you at the start of this that I would give you the truth. So there it is. So we ran the cart. Dana drove it, one-handed, her gray hand dead and useless in her lap. And Cliff rode the first 3 trips on the running board to teach her the exact line, the shallow edge path that ran just inside the field where the dose was survivable if you were quick and did not stop. And where a foot to the left, it wasn't. They went out with the 80-year-old widow first, the one whose husband had died on the cot in the night, and they carried her along the line and past the western edge to where 2 officers waited in the clean air with a cache of water, the 20 gallons Dana had stolen. which we had brought out into the open and were pouring into every last person who needed it, every drop of it, so that at least in the end, the water went precisely where she had always sworn to everyone that it was going, and then back, empty and out again. 2 at a time, all through the 4th day, with the field lunging closer by the hour and the caches dropping and everyone taking turns in what shade was left. And Cora standing up on the hood of that dead car, telling the truth over and over in her low, steady voice. That some would get out today, and some would have to wait for a later trip. And that the waiting was the hardest and the bravest job on the island. And she would not lie to them about that either. Dana made 22 trips. I counted every single one of them and marked each one with a stone to set on the hood of the lead car, and I have the number burned into me for good. 40-some human beings carried out of the dead zone on a hand-wired golf cart by a woman whose own body was turning to gray stone even as she drove it, who would not stop to rest for 1 minute because she knew down to the trip that she did not have the trips to spare, who on the 19th trip could no longer feel the arm resting on the knife switch and had Saul ride along on the back to throw it closed for her at the start of each run. On the 22nd trip, the gray had climbed all the way to her shoulder, the very same place it had reached on Terrence Voss's body at the moment he stopped breathing on the first afternoon. And she brought the cart back in for a 23rd load, and she could not get herself up and out of the seat. And Cliff lifted her out of it with his arms under hers the way you lift a child. And she died in the last thin band of shade against the east wall of the admin building. At the safe end, the farthest point on the whole island from the thing in the wash, with more people alive on the far side of the wall because of her final day than had died of the whole disaster she'd made worse with her first 3. The field reached the admin building itself at dusk on the 4th day. We were gone from it by then, most of us, strung out in a long, ragged camp on the ridge to the north where the world still worked, where a struck match would light and a person could breathe air that didn't ache in the teeth. And the last ones still waiting on the cart were the youngest and the fastest, the ones who could sprint the final open stretch on their own 2 feet when the edge came for them. Cliff drove the last loads himself. He got every soul out but 2, an officer named Paris and Cliff himself. And when the field finally overtook the last of the property, Cliff drove that cart out one final time at a flat, dead run along the shrinking western edge with Paris hanging onto the back rail. And he cleared it, cleared the line by a matter of feet. And the cart's batteries died the instant the 2 of them crossed out of the dead zone, just went flat and dead all at once. Cliff always said afterward it was only the field letting go of the cart and the old batteries finally being spent at the same moment. Plain physics. But I have always privately believed it was something else, something I've never had a name for, the same way I never had a name for the smell. Help came on the morning of the 5th day. Not because Dana got out and brought it. She never did leave the island. Her body is somewhere under that dead zone still, for all I know. Help came because Cora had been dead right on the very first night, in the break room, when she made us all sit with it. The thing was bigger than us. A dead zone that took down a federal checkpoint and a stretch of southern Arizona and the microwave relay to a whole sector office did not go unnoticed by the people whose actual job it is to notice such things. They came in from the north edge on foot, in gear I did not recognize on people who did not introduce themselves, from an agency I had never once heard named in 26 years of federal service. And they already knew exactly what had fallen into our wash. They had known within hours of 2:14 on the very first afternoon. And they had not come for us, for 4 days, while we died and rationed and carried each other out on a golf cart, because coming for 172 people was never the priority. The thing in the sand was the priority. We were 168 people who happened to have been standing next to it when it came down. They took our statements one at a time in a tent, and they moved the survivors to a facility that was very plainly not a hospital. And they were kind about the whole thing in the particular practiced way that people are kind when they have done this before and have a written procedure for the kindness. Cliff's cart they photographed from every angle with something that wasn't quite a camera. And then they took it. And when I asked the man taking my statement what it was that had fallen, and whether more of it had fallen anywhere else in the world, and whether the dead zone would keep on growing until it took the whole valley, he looked at me across the folding table for a long moment, weighing something. And then he said the one fully honest thing anybody in any kind of uniform said to me that entire week. He said, "It stopped growing the moment we neutralized the source. Yours was one of 9 that came down that same afternoon across 4 states. The other 8 came down where there weren't any people. That's the only reason you're the one I'm sitting across from right now, instead of a report." And then he would not say one more word about any of it, and I have never in all the years since learned whether that was the truth, or a kindness dressed up as truth, or most likely both at the same time. I don't work the border anymore. I couldn't do it. I could not stand inside a metal booth and listen to a long line of engines idling in the heat without my whole body waiting, every second, for them to stop all at once. I put in my papers within the year, and I moved north, all the way up out of the desert, to a green town in the mountains where it rains most afternoons in the summer. Because after all of it, I wanted, more than I have ever wanted anything, to live somewhere that fire always works, and water falls out of the sky for free, and nobody has to ration it or hide it or die for the last of it. I understand that's not really how any of it works, that water is never truly free and safety is never truly bought. But it helps me sleep some nights, to look out at the rain. I think about Dana Whitmer every single day of my life. Not about the water, not anymore. About the trips. 22 trips with her own body dying underneath her, carrying out into the clean air the very people she had been fully prepared to leave behind in the dirt. And she did it because an old man found the right words to say through a chained door and gave her a way to be the person she had wanted to be, instead of the person she had let herself become. And I do not know. I have never once known whether I did the right thing standing at that door. Because here is what I cannot get past. No matter how many years of rain I put between myself and that valley. If I had simply let her drive out alone that morning, the way she wanted to, the way she had planned it, she would have made it. She was strong enough that morning. The gray hadn't spread past her wrist yet. She could have driven 42 miles and lived a whole life, and sent help back, and that help might have reached us a full day sooner and saved the handful we lost in the last hours of the 4th day, by talking her into staying, into running the cart at the shallow edge over and over and over. I saved 40-some people with my own eyes. 40 people I watched breathe clean air. And I were also killed her, as surely as if I'd done it with my hands, because every single trip she made pushed that gray further up her arm, and the one woman on that island who could have walked away and lived, died doing the thing I stood at a door and talked her into. I've told you she made 22 trips. I've told you she died at the safe end with more alive than dead on her account. What I have not told you, what I have never once been able to say out loud to another human being in all these years, is that on trip 14, when the gray was still only at her elbow and she still had the strength to quit and be carried out to safety herself and live, she stopped the cart in front of me and looked at me for a long moment with her good hand on the switch. And she asked me, plainly, quietly, whether she should keep going. And I said yes. So I'm going to ask you the thing I've been asking myself in the dark for all these years. And I mean it. I read every comment on this one. I always do. She stole the water. She stole the boat. She was ready to leave 140 people to die of thirst in the heat to save her own life. And then she gave that same life, spent it down to nothing, carrying those exact people out into the air one and two at a time until her heart stopped. So what do you do with a person like that in the end? What did she earn from us? The hatred for what she took, or the grace for what she gave? And then the harder one, the one I truly need you to answer, because I never could, not in all this time. When she stopped the cart on trip 14 and asked an old man whether she should keep going. And I said yes. And my one word cost her the life she could still have saved, the whole life she had left to live. Was that mercy that I gave her? Or was it the very last thing I stole from her? I still don't know. Tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. And tell me honestly what you would have said through that door, and what you would have said on trip 14. Because I have had years of it now, in the desert, in the mountains, and all the rain a man could ask for. And I still have nothing at the end of it but her face on trip 14, tired and gray and steady, waiting for an old man to tell her whether to live or to die, and me choosing the boat over the woman. One more time, the very same way she chose the boat first. The lane never went quiet. I told you that at the start. That was the first wrong thing. And the last wrong thing, the one I'll carry out of this world with me, is that it has never once gone quiet since. Not out there in that valley, where I imagine the wind still moves across the sand over whatever's left of the both of them. And not in here, behind my eyes, where a line of engines is always just about to stop, all at once, and a good woman is always just about to ask me whether she should keep going. Not once, not for a single night, not in all the rain in the world,